Hey there, and welcome to Focus Fridays, helping start conversations in the coaching and educational spaces. I am Dan Mickle, and I'm glad you are spending some time with me today. And today I want to talk to you about something that quietly shapes so much of what we do as coaches and teachers and leaders. And it's often something that we do without even thinking about it or noticing it. And it's the stories that we tell. And I'm not talking about just the big stories like championship runs or comebacks, but the everyday stories, the way we describe our team, our players, our culture, and even ourselves. And have you ever stopped to consider how those stories impact motivation and how they shape how others see us and what they believe they can achieve? So there's a lot of layers to this. So let's kind of break it down. Face it, humans are wired for story. Before we wrote textbooks, before we had, statistics and film studies and the internet, of course, and all that stuff, and we had to tell these stories to make sense of the world. And in coaching and teaching and in leadership, that instinct is still alive and well. Every time that you say something like, this is a scrappy team, or we're a group of, guys or girls that just never gives up, or we always struggle against this opponent, you're building that narrative. You're shaping how your athletes, your students, how your staff see themselves. And here's the key. People often rise or shrink to fit those stories. Now, this is kind of where it gets interesting, at least from my standpoint. These stories are not always intentional. They kind of creep in during post-game talks, right? Or in casual hallway conversations, and even the little asides that we make to other coaches or parents. This group just isn't mentally tough, or we always fall apart in the third set. Or like my favorite, they're great kids, but we just don't have that edge. And without realizing it, we're starting to write that script. And more often than not, the people we lead start to follow that script, whether it's intentional or not. That is why being intentional about the narratives that we create is such an important part of our leadership and our coaching. So here's where we bring the science into it a little bit, all right? There's actually some well-studied psychological principle called narrative identity. And basically the idea is that the stories people tell themselves shape how they think, feel, and act. And in other words, the narrative becomes the lens through which they interpret their experiences and their lives. And researchers like Dan McAdams have shown that when people adopt empowering narratives like I'm a resilient learner, I can adapt to all these challenges, and they're more likely to persist through difficulties and grow. But on the flip side, negative narratives like I always choke under pressure and I'm not a natural athlete can become self-reinforcing and really hard to shake. So when we as coaches and teachers create these team narratives or classroom narratives, we are quite literally influencing how our athletes and students see their own abilities and their potential. And it's not just this motivational fluff, it's brain science. The stories shape the behaviors. Now, here's an extra layer to kind of put on top of that. Whose voices are shaping those stories? Sometimes it's just us, the coaches, the leader, the teacher, but sometimes it's teammates, parents, and social media is also adding into that, making an even broader culture of sport or school. And that's why it's important that we as leaders step in and intentionally guide the narrative in a healthy direction. And let's not forget, we do this to ourselves too. How many times do we walk around carrying our own unexamined coaching stories, right? I'm not good at coaching this or teaching this. I struggle to connect with this generation, or I can't coach the mental side. Those are all also stories, and they shape the way we choose and how we work, what we avoid, and really how we even show up for practice and the moods that we show up in. The beautiful thing about this is the stories can change. When we start telling more empowering and growth-focused stories, both of those that we lead and to ourselves, it can unlock this whole new level of motivation performance for us and for them. So again, the stories that we tell aren't always just for us or for the team. It's a combination kind of for both of us. So think about it. When a team starts hearing, we're the kind of group that learns fast. They begin to expect progress and they think that they're going to learn quickly on everything. When a student starts hearing things like you're someone who embraces a challenge, they start to take on those harder problems. So stories create these self-fulfilling, prophecies that we have. And the good news is we get to write them, and we write them as they are needed. I remember working with a coach who always told me the story of her team. Like her team was full of kids that didn't have natural talent, but man, did they work hard. And on the surface, that sounds like a positive statement, right? A great message to say, hard work, grit. But over time, what she started to notice was her athletes began to believe that somehow they're lacking the talent, and it affected their confidence. So she shifted her narrative to, we are a team that combines work ethic and growing skill. The entire tone changed. Her players began to embrace the idea that they could develop and create this talent through practice, not just compensate for the lack of it. So just shifting that story a little bit makes a huge difference. So here's this week's question I want you to ponder. What is one story that you were telling your athletes or your students this season or this year, and is it helping or hindering their growth? So take some time to think about that, and that is it for this week's Focus Friday. Take a moment to think about these questions and what we just talked about, how it might shape your coaching and teaching this week. The stories we tell matter, and when we become intentional about them, we can unlock new levels of motivation and learning. And if you want to keep this conversation going, visit my website, danmickle.com. Check out my newsletter, It Got Me Thinking, at news.danmickle.com. And of course, tune into my podcast, The Mentalcast, at mentalcast.com. Thanks for being here, and I will see you next Friday.